Okay, hi everyone. So, what I want to do today is to go through a report that came out back in November of last year called How We Get Along, the Diversity Study of England and Wales 2020. It's about England and Wales, but I think it would probably apply many of the same interesting points to most sort of Western societies. And I mentioned back in November, at least to my patrons, maybe on my channel as well, that I was really looking forward to getting my teeth into this and going through this because I found some of what is within it really rather fascinating and unexpected. And I think that a lot of you will as well. Okay, so I'm going to go through that report now. But the reason I didn't at the time is because the appendices actually had some tables missing that were really rather important, at least to showing the information graphically. So I contacted one of the authors of the report at the Wolf Institute, and they said, yeah, a bit of a mess up there. It hasn't published properly. We're going to update that. We're going to sort it out. Well, duly that has happened, and now I have time to do this some justice. And yes, it's been 3 months since I was last on YouTube, and this maybe isn't the best report to start with, given that it's 111 pages long with appendices, which aren't just tables of information. There's actually more written parts in the appendices than there are in the actual report that extends to another 168 pages. But I've condensed it down to some of the most interesting parts and to sort of go through some of that information with you, which I hope you'll find really, really interesting. Now, in the context of this, of course, and I'm going to maybe sound a little bit cynical here, but there was a recent government report in the UK about amongst other things, racism within society, but institutional racism. And to the utter dismay of some people who were just desperate to find just how racist the UK must be, because that's how they feel about the UK, and obviously reality must comport with how they feel. The report did not find that. It looked at the statistics, it looked how things function in our society, and it could not evidence that, and that is what the report said. And we ended up with this wonderful double bind in the media amongst some of these commentators, whereby if the report had come out and said, yeah, we've looked at it, and it does appear that the UK is institutionally racist, these people would have gone, ha, this proves what we've been saying all along, that the UK is institutionally racist. Instead, to paraphrase them, what they've effectively gone is, ha, the fact that this report makes the case that the UK is not institutionally racist is evidence of just how institutionally racist the UK is. It's like you can't win, right? For a lot of people, when a report like this comes out, this has been my observation over the years, unless it tells them what they want to hear, unless the statistical information, as I say, comports with how they feel, then there must be something wrong with it, because surely the world has to fit in with their experience of it, however biased their experience of it may be. But that's as maybe. That is that report. This report is not dealing with institutional racism. It's not really necessarily dealing with racism. It's dealing with people's attitudes towards other people. And unlike a lot of these reports, it doesn't frame it in the usual sort of way where racism is just sort of functioned as this sort of white working class attitude towards everybody else. You know, they're the sort of racist ones and everybody else is the victim. But it actually looks at all different groups and their attitudes towards one another. And that's why some of the results of this report are really rather surprising, and why I've got the green screen here today, folks, because there's going to be some information for you to see on screen. Okay, so without further ado, let me read out what are some of the key findings of this report, so it'll give you an idea of where it's at. Okay, this was a study, by the way, of about 11,500 individuals over a 2-year period. Diversity. There is a national consensus that diversity is good for British society. We get along. Importantly, positive attitudes towards diversity are common between majority and minority groups. For example, there were no differences between white and Asian respondents in respect of attitudes towards ethnic diversity in British society, nor is there divergence amongst religious believers with respect to migrant and local communities. Most people, 53% in England and Wales, agree that ethnic diversity is good for British society. Just under half, 46%, agree that migrants are good for British society. A fifth, 20%, disagree. 41% agree that religious diversity is good for British society. Nearly a quarter disagree. Okay, and so I've been showing you the actual tables there on the screen, the pie charts to give you the actual figures there whilst reading that out. But then listen to this, change. This is a little bit different now. Despite positive attitudes towards diversity, many people across England and Wales appear to be uncomfortable with the pace of national and local change. There is an emerging consensus that for many it has been too quick. Almost two-thirds of people, 60% in England and Wales, agree that the number of migrants in Britain has increased too quickly in the past 10 years. 17% disagree. Half, exactly 50%, agree that ethnic diversity in Britain has increased too quickly in the last 10 years. 21% disagree. 43% of respondents agree that religious diversity in Britain has increased too quickly over the past 10 years. 19% disagree. And again, I'm showing you the charts there as I'm talking about this. Now, why this is important is that we're looking at two slightly contrasting things here. We're talking about attitudes towards diversity, right? The actual concept of diversity within the United Kingdom and how people feel about that. And then we're talking about attitudes towards migration. And this is really, really important because a lot of people seem to make the claim that attitudes towards migration are some kind of dog whistle for racism, aren't they? These people who have issues about migration, it's all kind of white racist bigots who just don't want brown people into the country. That is the kind of way that it's framed. It's always framed that effectively migration is a proxy for not liking people of other races, and it's always framed in terms of white people. And so it's in light of this that this report is really rather interesting, because it challenges some of those preconceptions or the ways in which these debates and often these reports are usually framed, because it's at this point that they started to break those statistics down and show us what groups hold what views with regard to that. And it doesn't fit all the usual stereotypes. I'm not going to read all of this out because there's too much, and some of it does fit in with the stereotypes. When it comes towards negative attitudes towards ethnic diversity, number of migrants and religious diversity, as you probably would expect, women are a bit more tolerant than men, the young are a bit more tolerant than the old, people who voted Remain are obviously going to be more tolerant than people who voted Leave, that kind of goes without saying. People who live in London tend to be more tolerant, in fact, than people who don't live in London, but it's other than that, it's maybe not what you would expect. So let me read out some choice cuts from this. Okay, negative attitudes towards increased ethnic diversity in Britain first. Ethnicity. Compared to white respondents, our reference category, respondents in the Asian group were 57% more likely to agree that ethnic diversity has increased too quickly in Britain. Religion, compared to the no religion group, Christian respondents were 36% more likely. Respondents in the other religion group, including Buddhist respondents, were twice as likely, 95% more likely to be precise. In terms of people living in the most diverse parts of the country, compared to respondents living in the least diverse local authorities, those living in the most were 86% more likely to agree. So maybe that goes against what you would expect, actually, in many ways. Negative attitudes towards increased number of migrants in Britain. This is always a really, really hot topic. If you're against migration, if you show any concerns against migration, let's be honest, it's largely been the left that's played this race card, right? If you show any problems with regard to migration, then you're obviously sort of middle-aged, white, closet racist type. Listen to this. Ethnicity compared to white, this kind of astounded me, this figure. Compared to white respondents, our reference group, Asian respondents were 47% more likely to agree that the number of migrants has increased too quickly in Britain. Respondents in the other ethnic group, which included black respondents, were 37% more likely. So effectively, pretty much everybody. The white group is the group that showed the least amount of concern towards the number of migrants in Britain. Now, whether that is a genuinely held feeling or whether it's because sort of those people have been browbeaten a bit that if you say that, then you must be racist, whereas the people in the Asian group and in the other group, which included black people within the UK, they feel more at liberty to say that. If a black person says, yeah, I think there are too many migrants coming into the UK, then people will assume they must mean for other reasons. They're talking about different cultures. They're talking about the sheer number of people in the United Kingdom. They're talking about jobs and all these different things, where if it's a white person, maybe they're a little bit more reticent. I don't know whether it's that or whether it is genuinely that people from those other groups have more concern. Perceived diversity. Respondents who agreed their local authority is nationally diverse were less positive towards increased number of migrants. Actual diversity. Living in local authorities with more migrants appears to reduce positive feelings towards them. And interestingly, as you'll see when we get to the very conclusions at the end, I'll read you out their conclusions at the end because I think they're fascinating, right? This doesn't just include local authorities that are predominantly white and working class. It includes local authorities where minority groups are in the majority and they still express the same views towards increases in diversity within their community. They respond in exactly the same way. Negative attitudes towards increased religious diversity in Britain. Ethnicity. Compared to white respondents, Asian respondents were 51% more likely to agree that religious diversity has increased too quickly in Britain, which I found astounding, actually. I really didn't expect that, given that Asian respondents are the most religiously diverse group. You're talking about Buddhists, Hindus, Sikhs and Muslims, all within that group. They're the least likely to be Christian, the most likely to be from one of those other groups, and they're the ones who had the most negative attitude towards religious diversity, or at least the rate at which it's increasing in Britain. Religion. Compared to respondents in the no religion group, our reference category, respondents in the other religion group were 64% more likely to agree that religious diversity has increased too quickly in Britain. Perceived diversity. Respondents who agreed their local community is religiously diverse were less positive towards increased religious diversity in Britain. Similarly, living in religiously diverse communities appears to reduce positive attitudes towards such diversity. So it's a kind of really interesting mixed picture there. With regard to where people live, when you take a diverse place like London as a whole, attitudes were quite tolerant towards diversity, and attitudes were more positive towards diversity in London, which is the most diverse part of the UK, than there were anywhere else. And yet the attitudes towards the rate of change were actually more cynical, more hostile towards the rate of change in those areas with the highest levels of diversity and change of diversity, like London. So as the report goes on to say, this really disassociates those two things. You know, you can hold these things in tension quite easily. It's not the conundrum that it's made out to be, that you can have positive views on diversity, both in terms of race, in terms of ethnicity and religion, and yet have negative views towards the pace, the rate of change at which those things are happening. What the report then goes on to do, really, really interesting then, is to break some of those groups down and look at three different things. Marriage, because attitudes towards a familial marriage, right, not you getting married, but somebody in your close family getting married to somebody from another group, is often seen as a good proxy to our sort of inner feelings of how these towards these other groups. So it looks at that. It also looks at the workplace and people working with people from other groups within the workplace, and it also looks at friendships. I'm only going to look at the marriage one because, one, it was the one that I found most interesting, to be frank, but two, because this video will just go on forever if I go through it all. So let's have a look at those attitudes towards marriage next. So this is what they had to say to begin with before we get on to what are some rather interesting breakdowns. Marriage. We are a society largely comfortable with the idea of a close relative marrying someone from a different ethnic or national background. This is often seen in social science circles as a proxy for the acceptance of diversity. We are, however, less comfortable with a close relative marrying someone from a different religious background. This particularly applies to marrying a Muslim, the group most often targeted by negative attitudes from other faith groups, but also the group, as you'll get to see as I go through these stats, most likely to have negative attitudes towards other faith groups. Religious prejudice rather than racism or xenophobia is the final frontier for diversity, a place where individuals are willing to express negative attitudes. Around 3/4 of us are comfy with a close relative marrying an Asian or black person, 70 and 74%. Less than half, 44%, are comfortable with the idea of a close relative marrying a Muslim. The word Muslim appears to trigger more negative sentiment than the word Pakistani. Given the vast majority of British Pakistani people are Muslim, we would expect feelings towards both groups to be broadly similar. However, feelings towards a close relative marrying a Muslim person appears to be more negative than towards a Pakistani person. Attitudes between faith groups are more negative than between ethnic and national groups. The strongest negative attitude towards marrying someone from another background are observed when we group the survey respondents by religion. Despite the evidence of uncomfortable marriage feelings between faith groups, our interviews suggest that attitudes within minority faith communities are far from static. On the contrary, they're undergoing significant generational shifts. In particular, British Muslim women are exercising more freedom to decide when, whom and how to marry. That's a good thing to hear, certainly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read out some of these attitudes, give you the stats. Let me bang these tables up while I do so. So the first table here, this is targets of marriage uncomfortableness by ethnicity. So this is like Asian people talking about how comfy they would be with a relative marrying an Arab person, another Asian person, a black person, a Chinese person, a white person, etc. So you have a look at the table while I give you a little bit more of the details here. So an Arab person. A third of white respondents, 34%, and around a quarter of Asian mixed and black respondents, 24, 21 and 25%, were uncomfortable with the idea of a close relative marrying an Arab person. Okay, an Asian person. Around 1 in 5 black and white respondents were uncomfortable with the idea of a close relative marrying an Asian person. A black person. 25% of Asian respondents and 14% of white respondents were uncomfortable with the idea of a close relative marrying a black person. A Chinese person. A quarter of Asian respondents, a category not including respondents who self-identified as Chinese, and around 1 in 6 black and white respondents, 18 and 14%, were uncomfortable with the idea of a close relative marrying a Chinese person. A white person, around 15% of Asian respondents were uncomfortable with the idea of a close relative marrying a white person. So by and large, most people were comfy with most of those groups. But what is telling is that really it's kind of all groups have a sort of underlying level of uncomfortableness with people marrying people of a different race for whatever reason. And it really isn't a case of sort of racist white people and everybody else, but that these attitudes seem to exist and prevail regardless of what racial category you ascribe yourself as coming from. Okay, attitudes towards people from different national backgrounds. Kind of interesting, some of the breakdowns here. Again, I'll show you the table. Over a third of white respondents and a smaller proportion of Asian, black and mixed respondents were uncomfortable with the idea of a close relative marrying someone from Egypt. France, 1 in 5 Asian respondents and 1 in 12 white respondents were uncomfortable with the idea of a close relative marrying someone from France. India, around 1 in 4 black and white respondents and around 1 in 5 mixed and Asian respondents were uncomfortable with the idea of a close relative marrying someone from India. Half of white respondents, 40% of black respondents, and over a third of mixed and Asian respondents were uncomfortable with the idea of a close relative marrying someone from Iraq. Attitudes appear cooler than towards someone from Egypt. No shit, I wonder why. Jamaica, a third of Asian respondents, 33%, and around 1 in 5 white and mixed respondents, 21 and 19%, were uncomfortable with the idea of a close relative marrying someone from Jamaica. Nigeria, 40% of Asian respondents and between a third and a quarter of white, mixed and black respondents were uncomfortable with the idea of a close relative marrying someone from Nigeria. Pakistan, 40% of white respondents and around a third of black, mixed and Asian respondents were uncomfortable with the idea of a close relative marrying someone from Pakistan. Poland, a third of Asian respondents and a quarter of black respondents and about, 13% of white respondents were uncomfortable with the idea of a close relative marrying someone from Poland. Overall attitudes appear cooler than towards people from France. So I think you can maybe see a little bit of a trend there, which is that some nationalities were universally less popular than others, but there seemed to be overlaying these things a kind of maybe a racial element as well. So Asian people were a little bit warmer towards Asian people from a different country or from a different country of origin than other groups. Asian peoples were more hostile towards the Polish and the French, which are of course majority white countries. When it came to Nigeria, it was Asian people who were most hostile, most uncomfortable, let's say, with that, whereas black respondents at 23% were the least uncomfortable with regard to that. Of course, Nigeria, a majority black country. So some of that kind of ported across. Okay, the different religious backgrounds was the most interesting one. Let me show you the chart here. And there's a wonderful sort of half red cross on that chart, which shows you just kind of what's going on here. You know, it's often talked about the fact that Muslim people are sort of the most hostile attitudes towards Muslim people, but that seems to work both ways. This is what they wrote. Majorities in more than one religious groups held negative attitudes towards Muslims. A majority of Christian, Hindu and Jewish respondents were uncomfortable with the idea of a close relative marrying a Muslim person. 53%, 59% and 61%. Further, 2 of these groups contained majorities that were comfortable with a close relative marrying someone from a non-Muslim group. A majority of Christian respondents felt comfortable about Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish and Sikh people and people of no faith. A majority of Jewish respondents felt comfortable towards Buddhist, Hindu and Sikh. In other words, Muslims were singled out by both the Jewish and Christian respondents. We see evidence that respondents within the Christian and Jewish groups were comfortable with some other faith groups, but not Muslims. These findings suggest strongly that in some cases marriage attitudes were driven by prejudice as well as adherence to religious values and norms. Now, then, this is the other half of the equation, 5 other groups were targeted by majority attitudes held by respondents within another religious groups. Buddhists, Hindus, Jews and Sikh people and those of no faith were all groups targeted by majorities within another faith group. In each of these cases, the source of those majority uncomfortable responses was the Muslim group. In other words, a majority of Muslim respondents were uncomfortable with the idea of a close relative marrying a Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish or Sikh person or someone with no religion. They then go on to say Muslims were both the primary target for uncomfortable responses, but also the primary source. To put it another way, the Muslim group outnumbered the other religious groups in terms of being both the target and the source of negative attitudes held by a majority. Okay, so what do I make of that? Well, actually, in some ways, it's broadly in line with what I expect. It's also broadly in line with what I would hope for. There will be people who will interpret some of those things as prejudice, but I think you've got to look a little bit deeper than that. After all, people's attitudes and beliefs do matter to us. I always think we live in a kind of a bit of a strange world where people feel that you've got to be respectful for people's religious beliefs, and yet that same person will happily write Tory scum right on a daily basis on Facebook or whatever. So clearly they don't feel that a political belief has to be held in the same reverence. But really, what is the difference? All of these things have social and political impacts. Religious beliefs do, political beliefs do. Sure, not every Muslim thinks the same thing or believes the same thing. Neither does every Christian. Neither does every person who doesn't have a religion. But the same thing is true of people on the political right or people who are on the political left. These are things that have a quite diverse... You can be a Labour Party member or a Conservative Party member and have views that are very, very different to another person within that same party, but you still subscribe to that party. And the same thing is true with religion. And yet we seem to hold a political belief and a religious belief, even when that religious belief carries with it political convictions and political beliefs. We seem to hold these two things very, very differently. I've always said that should not be the case, and that we're cutting religion some slack where we shouldn't do. But it also means, I think, that there's nothing wrong with being cynical or slightly concerned about people, uncomfy with people with other religious beliefs, because these have real life traction. And that is maybe one of the reasons that most of these groups were a little bit happier with Christians than everybody else is again something that I've mentioned before, which is that I've mentioned this on a number of occasions on different videos, which is that effectively in the UK, Christianity is so lukewarm, milquetoast. Nobody, most people who are Christians, I've showed you this statistic before, where almost 50% of people who claim to be a Christian in the United Kingdom don't believe in God. Right, that's how seriously they take it. Indeed, let me read you this out, because one thing this report included was some comments from some people to furnish some of the answers that they'd given. Sarah, a female rabbi from London, was careful to recognise the role of prejudices, but also of other considerations. There is maybe an element of Islamophobia. I'm not trying to deny it, but if I thought about Muslims or Sikhs or Hindus, the difference between those and Christians, bear in mind she's a rabbi, she's a Jew, is that you're talking about other minority faith groups. Why is that relevant? Because they're all groups that are small relative to the general population and all are seeking to preserve their own ethno-religious identity. Ultimately, they all seek to preserve their ethno-religious identity. When somebody's going to marry a Christian, they are not going to marry somebody who has a strong faith themselves. But if they marry a Muslim, most of the people who are not involved in interfaith dialogue will assume that person to be a religious person. Do I want a close relative to marry somebody who is going to pull them out of the Jewish religion? It's more likely in people's minds, if you're marrying a Muslim, Hindu or Sikh, there is a more comprehension in our religion that these are faith groups where people tend to be more observant, more involved on some level than most Christians are. I accept that's absolutely valid, and I think in many ways, in my view, somebody being uncomfy with somebody marrying somebody of another religious faith is very, very similar to somebody who is, for example, from a left-wing socialist tradition, finding out that one of their relatives is marrying a lifelong conservative voter, or likewise somebody who comes from that kind of tradition where everybody votes conservative traditionally is marrying somebody who comes from a family that have always voted Labour. I don't really see any difference between those things, because marriage has the same religion has the same implications on social issues. They're general things. Not everybody of that religion thinks the same thing, but that's exactly the same when it comes to right-wing and left-wing politics. So I don't see how one is sort of okay, whereas the other's probably just some kind of proxy for racism. I don't buy that. So for me, those statistics, that's all pretty heartwarming. Generally, when it came down to where people come from or what the colour of their skin is, people were far less concerned about that than they were when it comes down to what people believe. That's kind of what I would have liked to have seen. The last bit it then goes on to here, attitudes towards marrying people from different religious backgrounds when grouped by ethnicity. So this is asking everybody who is Asian how they feel about marrying people from different backgrounds. Asking everybody who's black how they feel about marrying everybody from different backgrounds. Let me put the chart up there. The first thing you will see actually that in this terms, that the often pilloried as the most racist white people are actually the most tolerant in this sense. Again, the grey boxes are the boxes where there wasn't a big enough population. I'm assuming the reason that the black people, how they feel about marriage comfortableness towards Christians is grey because most of the black people who were surveyed were Christian, and so there wasn't a big enough population of non-Christian black people to be able to ask the question about, because Christianity would need to be a religion other than their own. Okay, just to make that clear. But of the statistics that they got, let me put some numbers on that. Buddhists, 40% of Asian respondents, a third of black respondents, and 21% of white respondents were uncomfortable with a close relative marrying a Buddhist person. Christians, 28% of Asian respondents and less than 1 in 10 white respondents were uncomfortable with a close relative marrying a Christian person. That goes back to what that rabbi had said, that Sarah, that rabbi, that maybe these figures are a little bit lower for Christians than everybody else because people know that for most people, if they say that they're Christians, or for at least half the Christians in the country, it doesn't really mean very much. It's just a sort of broad social identification rather than an actual belief in God. Hindu, over 40% of Asian respondents and around a third of black and white respondents and 1 in 5 mixed respondents were uncomfortable with a close relative marrying a Hindu person. Jewish, over 40% of Asian respondents and a third of black respondents. 1 in 5 white respondents were uncomfortable. Muslims, around half of white and Asian respondents, 47% and 44%, and around a third of black and mixed respondents were uncomfortable with a close relative marrying a Muslim person. Sikhs, 40% of Asian respondents and between a third and a quarter of black, white and mixed respondents were uncomfortable with a close relative marrying a Sikh person. So a lot of that is probably what you would expect. For Asian people where these religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, and to a lesser extent Sikhism, are all living in these countries, in their societies that they are, maybe they're not personally from, but their parents, they're descended from those countries and their cultures, and there is a lot of antagonism. There is a lot of tension there. So you would expect to see that, just as you would expect to see a certain amount of tension between Muslims and Jewish because of other conflicts, obviously, with regards to that. No religion, over 40% of Asian respondents and a third of black respondents and around 1 in 10 white respondents were uncomfortable with a close relative marrying a person of no faith. Okay. So that was it with regard to that. I hope you can see there that really this paints a very different perspective, I think, from the perspective you usually see. Usually if you get a report with regard to race and diversity, it's nearly always framed in terms of the bigotries of white people and how that impacts upon society. Racism's a white problem, but making it everybody else's problem. But actually what it shows is, I think in terms of the UK, that a lot of what is called out as racism isn't really racism. It's people's concerns about high levels of immigration and just to quicker change in terms of society and the diversity of cultures and things within society, rather than anything to do with the colour of people's skin. And duly those concerns are not just shared amongst minority ethnic groups within the UK, but those minority ethnic groups within the UK actually in many cases express a greater level of concern when it comes to things like immigration and the immigration of people from different cultures and of different religions than do the white sort of indigenous population that is usually seen as the problem group, the racist group in that regard. It's a much more complicated picture, I think. And the study sums that up. I'm going to read out this discussion points, which wasn't the end of everything they'd wrote, but I think it sort of sums up the whole report. So I want to read that out. And then once I've done that, I'll just tell you about what my next video will be on. So just have a listen to this. Our analysis of attitudes towards change revealed patterns of consensus similar to those revealed by our analysis of attitudes towards diversity. However, whereas public attitudes towards diversity were largely positive, attitudes towards change were markedly less so. Over 3 times as many agreed that the number of migrants had increased too quickly in Britain than disagreed. Twice as many agreed that ethnic diversity has increased too quickly in Britain than disagreed. Twice as many agreed that religious diversity has increased too quickly than disagreed. How are we to explain these findings? Arguably, our existing frameworks and applications lack utility. Previous studies have sought to celebrate multiculturalism whilst placing a spotlight on white working class communities, with implications about such groups being especially culpable for racism and bigotry. Whilst this is undoubtedly the case in certain specific contexts, our analysis reveals that negative attitudes towards increases in diversity are common between majority and minority groups. For example, we found Asian respondents with negative attitudes towards increased ethnic and religious diversity and increased numbers of migrants in Britain. We found attitudes towards migrants that were shared between faith groups. We found several examples of negative attitudes towards local change held by respondents from minority backgrounds, including among Muslim respondents and respondents from minority ethnic backgrounds. In sum, and perhaps rather ironically, it would appear our framework, lexicons and debates concerning attitudes towards diversity and change themselves require change and diversification. Reconciling attitudes towards diversity and change. It's good, this. It's good. This is really good stuff, I think, this bit. Political debates around race and immigration often rely on arguments that seek to stereotype opponents and opposing views. I will just insert there, as has been shown with this recent government report and some of the response that it has received, often from people who didn't even bother to read it. Carries on. Some right-wing politicians and commentators use caricatures of more left-leaning opponents as metropolitan elites fixated on woke agendas and identity politics, deaf to the voices of the ordinary working people, particularly in the north, and naive to the consequences of unlimited immigration. In turn, some left-wing debaters regularly depict conservative opponents as trading in dog-whistle politics, purveyors of policies which seek to justify or perpetuate unwelcome nationalist and far-right values. Our findings suggest that neither side offer a complete picture of British attitudes towards diversity and change, and that both are highly likely to overestimate our differences. Instead, our analysis provides strong evidence of a Britain largely at ease with itself over issues of ethnic diversity and migrants, but with demonstrably less positive attitudes towards and between faith groups and apparent concerns over the pace of national and local change. On the one hand, positive, on the other, less so. For parliamentarians and policymakers, both within government and opposition, our analysis suggests the existence of a national consensus on diversity and change that offers opportunities for coalitions, wider bases of support, and broader appeal. For example, findings that suggest pro-diversity and pro-immigration control positions are neither contradictory nor irreconcilable, despite the vocabulary of political debate from the far left and far right. The strengthening of minority rights and protections alongside tighter immigration controls, for example, need not be viewed as necessarily incompatible. Reconciling positive attitudes towards diversity and less positive attitudes towards change is achievable, but only if we accept that we are less divided than we often assume. Okay, I won't hold my breath, folks. I've got to say, whilst ever it's easier to make a soundbite, whilst ever it's easier to use a sort of auto win button, right, to confound your opponent's argument rather than provide an argument of yourself. People will fall back on that kind of politics because however fucking lazy it is, quite honestly, the fact is it's a much easier game to play than actually to get into the weeds and the complexity of how these issues actually are. Okay, I hope you found that report interesting. Some of that information may have been a little bit hard going as a video, not as hard going as reading the whole report, but that's the nature of these things. There's a lot of information to look at there, and I hope that it's shown you some sides to these things that aren't usually shown. It's some information that maybe isn't often discussed, the way that these contexts actually are. We're a multicultural society, folks, so if we're going to look at these issues, we should be looking at these issues as a multicultural society and not as if the United Kingdom is still a monoculture with this sort of inside group that has to be inspected and policed and everybody else. And you know, it's just not the way that you can function it, right? These are all different groups who are integrating with one another and have opinions on one another. Okay, that's it. Interested to know what you think about that. My next video, I'm not going to get back to making the same number of videos as I used to have. My life won't allow for that at the moment, but I'm going to make another video this month. And it will be a video follow-up to a video I made about this kind of time, a little bit earlier than this, about 30 months ago, I think, on the COVID-19 thing. We didn't even call it that at the time. The coronavirus thing as was. Where I gave you some of my opinions on how I thought all this was going to pan out, the naivety of attitudes at the time, the latest medical advice which had just been released, which a lot of people weren't party to, the economic implications of it all. So I want to do an update on that. Somebody asked me to do so, and I thought that would be a damn good idea. Let's go through those things and see what I feel about them now. And then you can let me know how you feel about what I've said. If you'd like to support my work, as usual, my Patreon is still there. Thank you to all my patrons who've stood by me for the last 3 months when I haven't made any videos. It hasn't cost them anything, folks, because I only take pledges on a per video basis. If you'd like to support me on Patreon, you can do so, and you'll only support the videos that I do make. A little bit of an apology to those that support me on PayPal recurring payments, because the last 3 months they have been supporting me when I haven't been making videos, but thank you for doing so. I aim to be making videos every month from this point onwards. You can also support me now. I'm moving with the times, folks, with cryptocurrencies. So if you have a favorite crypto, or perhaps a crypto you don't particularly like and want to get rid of, and you want to support my channel, I can give you an address. I can give you a public key, and you could support me that way if that's what floats your boat. Thank you to those that are supporting my material already. For all of you, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you've got something out of it. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.